Hello world, Lisa Friedrichsen, your friend and computer science professor with another short screencast from javascript.info, the Modern JavaScript tutorial. We are working in part 2, connecting JavaScript to the browser and the web page, and all the way down into section 4, forms, and the controls on the form, the boxes and the radio buttons and the check boxes that we check when we're filling out a form. And I'm really excited to be at this point in time because sending messages to a user based on how they're filling out a form and helping them fill out a form successfully and accurately is one of the initial purposes of JavaScript. The first lesson basically talks about form properties and methods in how do we talk to the different items on a form. And I've developed this short little form to demonstrate the concepts in this very first lesson. I've got some different input boxes. These are text. I've got a couple input boxes that are numeric. I've got a nice date input box here that gives me the date picker in most modern browsers. I've got some radio buttons, and I've also got a select and 3 options for that drop-down select list. So this is a lot of new HTML and CSS. So you may want to shore up your skills in those areas. If you're not super familiar with the label and input elements in HTML, because we're going to be talking to them in JavaScript. And the first thing that the author talks about is how do we talk to the form itself? And there are several different ways. In my JavaScript here, I've got several different console.log statements. The first way he teaches us is to simply reference the document, the forms collection, forms property of the document, and then we have to identify exactly which form we want on the document, because we might have more than one form. So this forms property is going to return a collection of all the forms, and even though we only have one form, in my case, we still have to identify which one we want, and I've ID'd it as test. So I'm going to save and refresh my page, look in my console, and see what that console log gives us. And it indeed, on line 38, gives us that entire form, which I have ID'd as test in my HTML. And if I expand it, I see the field list and the 2 buttons at the bottom, all the other elements, the label elements, the input elements. Second, an equivalent way of identifying the form is to, instead of using the ID attribute value of the form, is to identify the first form in the collection. And again, this collection is indexed starting with item 0. So if I save and refresh, now I'm console logging out that entire form in 2 different equivalent ways. And let me give you a third equivalent way. This goes back to our old friend, the get element by ID method. And we know that we put the ID value in as a string into the argument of that method. Save and refresh. And now I've got 3 equivalent ways to identify the form as a whole. So now that we know how to identify the form as a whole, I'm going to pick this particular statement and use it in my subsequent console logs, because now we're going to want to identify different individual elements on the form. And here's the first statement that he gives you. Document.forms, the first form. We know what that is. It's the whole form. And then the elements on the form. And then the name element. And this fname property is the ID value in the HTML of one of the elements. Let's save and refresh and see which one it is. As I point to it in my console, I'm highlighted above in my web page, and we see the ID of fname. If you want to speak to a specific input box, you can use this type of statement, or you can use your good old friend, get element by ID. If I want to specifically pull out something out of that element, then I can go one step further and console log out the value property of the fname object. I'm going to save and refresh, and now I'm console logging out the value, the default value that I put into that form of Lisa on line 42. So now we know how to address in a statement the form itself, as well as any individual element inside the form, as well as any individual property of that element inside the form. Let's look at some more complex elements. Let's look at the favorite class element. I'm going to save and refresh. And my favorite class are these 3 that are typed as radios. And if I open up that node list that's returned from the favorite class, I see that I've got a 0, a 1, and a 2. And here's 0, 1, and 2. And this favorite class property then relates to the name property of these radio buttons, because we know from our HTML skills that in order to get the ball to bounce between the mutually exclusive options, they have to have the same name value in the HTML. So this statement is returning a node list of every element with a name attribute of favorite class. And with that knowledge, I can then do something such as this statement. When the page loads, the statement's going to run document.forms, that's the first form. Let's dig into the elements. Let's get into the favorite class node list, which is 3 radio buttons that are named with favorite class. Let's go into the very first one in that node list, and let's set its checked property, assign it true. So that means when I save and refresh this page, by default, my very first element in this favorite class node list's checked property is set to true. So when you have an HTML input element of type radio or type checked, which is a checkbox, note that it has a checked property that is Boolean. And depending upon what you're doing in your form, you may want to check or uncheck a radio button or a checkbox. And this is the type of statement that you would use to do that. The next thing that I'm going to console log out is the fav major object, which is an element. Save and refresh. The fav major element is this select list. And a select list, if you know your HTML, it's sometimes called a drop-down list, and it's got option elements inside of it which relate to the different options on the list. So when I console log out fav major, I'm getting not only the parent select element, but all of its children, the option elements as well. And with that knowledge then, I can console log out the options inside the fav major. Let's save and refresh. And now I see that the fav major is the whole select list with 3 option elements in it, and just options is just an HTML options collection with the 3 option values in it. And the reason we want to know that is because we may want to do something programmatically to one of these options. For example, let's look at this statement. And what this is saying is, let's look at an element on the first form. Let's look at the fav major element. Let's look at the options inside the fav major, and let's go to the third option, which is index number 2. Let's set its selected property to true. Now the third option is going to be this web development. So I'm going to save my JavaScript and refresh my page, and notice that that third element, options 2, is now selected. A second way of doing that with a slightly shorter statement is to say, go to the first form, dig into the elements, go to the fav major element, and set its selected index to 2. Because when you have a select element, this is selected index 0, 1, and 2. So right away, even though I've selected database, when I refresh my page, this statement is running and the index number 2, which is the third item, is automatically selected. A third and equivalent way of doing that is to say document, go to the first form, dig into the elements, get the fav major element, and set its .value property to web. And I'm going to save and refresh. And the reason web development is selected is because if I look at the options, let's console log option 2. If I look at the second option, I see that its value is web in the console. That's why I can set the fav major element, the select element's value to web, because the web development, the text here, he has a value in the HTML of web. So these last 3 statements are equivalent. So that's what this first lesson is really about, how to write a statement to talk to specifically what you want to talk to on the form. Thank you.